a podcast about all things health and well-being with me, Ask Elizabeth, counsellor, health advocate and blogger. Join me as we get to know these guests and learn about how they implement health, well-being and self-care practices into their lives. Welcome to Unearthing Wellbeing with Ask Elizabeth, where our greatest wealth is health. Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of Unearthing Wellbeing. This next guest is CEO and co-founder of Vitae, Shelley Laslett, a startup that takes neuroscience out of the lab and into life to help people grow themselves and their business. She has helped a number of companies evolve, change, and bring their new ideas to life, including the Walt Disney Company, Qantas, Commonwealth ANZ and Westpac Banks, Apple Australia and Marie Claire, just to name a few. We spoke about how the innate human need for connection can really help us maintain mental well-being, emotions, gender norms, as well as a number of other things. Before I let you take a listen, I just wanted to give you a trigger warning as this episode discusses suicide and mental health. Now, without further ado, here is Shelley Laslett. Well, thank you, Shelley, for coming on. I'm really privileged to have someone from your background and knowledge on the show. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. It's always nice to be asked. So very happy to be here today. So I think we sort of talked about this before. When people say, tell me about yourself, I generally find this question pretty uncomfortable. So I'll give you a little bit of a high level. I'm a social scientist by training. I spent 10 years in business in startup world investment. And then I transitioned through the time of being in the corporate world into the startup world, into the venture capitalist world, and then eventually continued on with my postgraduate study, which is all in neuroscience, and particularly the neuroscience of mental health. So my big impetus for sort of going back down the academic lens and going back into science, coming perhaps from a non-traditional background, was what I realized about decision-making and investment was that most of the decisions that we make are actually quite emotional. We think they're very practical and logical, and we like to think of ourselves as rational beings. But actually, when it comes to things, even with investments where there are clear sums of money and whole numbers, it still comes down to temperament of the individual to make that idea, even if it is based on new technology, a reality. And so what we were constantly coming up against, what I was coming up against in the firm that I was in was, well, that's just soft, and I say inverted commas soft. But actually what we're learning from the science is it's quite hard. And it actually is the harder part of human interaction and human, I guess, being is actually understanding the well-being and also the mental well-being. So that's probably a little bit of a crash course over what was a very messy journey over the last 10 years. But very much probably started thinking about people, went into business, and now I'm back really focusing on people.
That's amazing. And the fact is, like, you can go in one direction and end up in a completely other, but you're also finding out what's good for you and what works best.
It's a journey. It's not linear. We think it is because it's kind of how we're conditioned from sort of 5 to maybe your mid-20s, from reception all the way up, or prep, all the way up until perhaps you graduate from your undergraduate degree, if that's what you wanted to do. You've just progressed linearly. You go from year 5 to year 6 to year 7 to year 8. And life isn't like that. Life takes twists and turns, and sometimes you move sideways to go forward, and sometimes you have to sort of go backwards to go forward again. But rest assured, it kind of does sort of figure it out, and I don't profess that it's figured out at all by any stretch of the imagination for me, but you just get used to the next evolutions of what that kind of looks like. But it's never linear. I think that's really important to reiterate. You move around, and it feels often like you're going in circles. But somehow you do navigate the how do I move out of this and go forward.
That's so true. And I like how you've described that. It's like a journey that has twists and turns, and you just roll with it.
You kind of have to. I think if 2020's taught us anything, there's so much beyond our control.
Mm-hmm.
We think we're in control, but really there's so many external realities that influence what we do. And I think this element of adapting is far more important than being a regimented planner. So planning has a place, absolutely. But it's our ability to replan and adapt and reprioritize and adjust when things don't go according to plan that really is important. And I think that really applies to your career as well. Was we kind of think as the career is this linear journey when that's, I think, a really sort of old school way of looking at it. I think particularly with tech, the way that the future of work will definitely evolve after this period of pandemic, we just can't look at it in a linear fashion anymore. It's just not realistic.
100%. And I think it's funny how we were all trained, I guess, to think that way, but as adults and as we learn and grow, we find our own way of, I guess, building ourselves up and taking our own paths.
Yeah, absolutely. Creating them when they don't exist. I mean, that is the definition of trailblazing, right? But equally, walking the trodden paths of those before us, because that's what feels right to us. I don't think either is any more less or, more important. It's just different. And at times we're going to want to do all of those things throughout our career. Hence, it's not linear.
Absolutely. And one of those pit stops or the journeys that you've taken is becoming the CEO at Vitae. Did you want to tell us more about that?
Sure. So the short version is it's difficult, but the long version is that it's worth it. So Vitae, as a company, we sort of have a number of things that we focus on, but the primary element of what we do is bring neuroscience out of the lab and into life. And we focus on social work that we sit alongside with organizations, including high growth organizations like startups and venture capital firms. And also what we sort of do with that is then can channel that into a one-to-one coaching conversation. Now, despite having the postgraduate qualifications in psychology, coaching is really a different type of conversation that is all about mental well-being. But it's done in a bit of a different way. And I think it's really important to call out to people that coaching has a sort of smoke and mirror effect to it often. And that's because many people use that blanket term to cover all manner of sins, unfortunately. But coaching, if we think about what coaching does, and particularly how we apply it at Vitae, is about helping you understand your own neurobiology behind behaviors and actions, and how those behaviors and those chemical reactions within your own mind through the interconnectivity of your neurons, your brain cells, can influence and govern actions and behaviors. And if we have a little bit more awareness of some of those pathways and processes within ourselves, we become much more aware of others, and therefore we become much more productive and effective, not only as a leader, but also as a team member in what we're trying to achieve. So a lot of what we focus on falls into organizational design as well, but it's more about the outcome of that, making sure that we've got the right people in the team, gelling together, working together, and working well. And I would say that perhaps this isn't anything new. I guess what makes it new-ish is that we now have a lot of science, and particularly neuroscience, to point to what we've probably innately, or philosophers and prophets and poets and, historians have talked about over time since we've been recording human history, what it really takes to be human and to work well together. So in that sense, we're not really answering anything new. We're just using a new age approach or, new research to really answer that age old question of what it means to be human and how can I be effective and how can I be the best version of myself.
Oh, that's brilliant. And the thing is, you're combining a few things, well, quite a few, to help people grow and become their best selves. So it's fantastic.
Exactly. Whatever that looks like to them. And that's going to change. I think that's really important. It's also about when do I need to be and bring my A game, but also realizing that life is a marathon, not a sprint. So we don't always have to be A game, and we don't always have to be living our best life. We can be in moments of struggle and solitude and disappointment And that's all okay. That's part of the tapestry of the human experience. But what it's more about is really giving people and equipping them with what we would call neuro tools and neuro hacks, those quick brain hacks in the moment where we can reorientate some of that thinking. And you know, from your own work, you very much understand how important that is.
Yeah.
But in a way that is a conversation about not what's wrong with me, but how can it be different?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important distinguishing factor or distinction, in the well-being space. It's about being well, right? Well-being is about being well, and there doesn't have to be something wrong with you or an absence of something for you to be unwell. So we often think it's quite binary. We're either sick or we're well. But when we think about mental well-being particularly, we're on this sliding scale and we're just looking at maintaining our own equilibrium. What's the range in which we're comfortable? And we don't always have to be living our best life. And our best life sometimes is actually chilling on a Saturday night watching Netflix with my family.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't look as Instagram of always traveling around the world.
And it's so true that, like, you've said that, because we aren't just one or the other. Like, we have to understand that every person is unique, and what looks amazing and crappy for one isn't how it will be for another person. So yeah,
completely.
If we take anything from this year, it's that mental health is really important, and if we aren't keeping check on that, then other things fall out of place too. So yeah,
I agree. Look, mental health is health, but I think there's such a stigmatization still around mental health being mental illness.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about mental health, there's got to be an absence of health. It has to be something to do that needs to be course corrected. And I also think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what it actually means to be human. So if we study ourselves like a species, as we study perhaps a bee species or a bird species or a dolphin species, we understand that at a very different level to perhaps what we understand to be ourselves, because Homo sapiens, we're still relatively an enigma in terms of the evolution cycle. So we know how we got here, we know that we've evolved, we can sort of track that process. But so much of who we are is an individual. So much of who we are is determined by, our environment and our genetics, and that is different for every single person because we all have our unique experiences. And so it becomes quite difficult to study us perhaps as a whole. But there are some common themes that I really think we've missed out along the way. And those common themes, when we think about mental well-being, that I think stands starkly, firstly, number one, is feeling. We think when we feel that there's almost something wrong with us. And we sort of want to have all the good and not the bad. And it just doesn't work like that. We haven't evolved over tens of thousands of years to have that level of chemical reaction. We need the good and the bad. And we need to feel, and we need to understand that feelings themselves are neither good or bad. It's what we do with them that perhaps connotates a negative or a positive outcome.
Yeah.
And I think we often forget those things. And if because we're really honest, we're probably not taught them. We're not told that when you feel sad, it's okay. We're often told when you feel sad that it's okay, and we try and remove you away from that sad situation into a positive. And whilst that serves a purpose, what we often and unconsciously do is blanket up feeling negative emotions.
Yeah.
But really we need to feel them with our positive emotions and know that when we do feel them, there isn't inherently anything particularly wrong with us. Our body is just doing its incredible job via our brain and giving us feedback that something's a bit not right, something's a bit funky, it's not sitting well. But often we don't like those feelings, so we push them away, and rather than go into that exploration, we try and ignore them. And I think that's when we can get into some of those sticky places along the mental health equilibrium, on the state, not the equilibrium, along the sliding scale that we all sit upon when we talk about mental health. But I think we really need to understand, particularly from 2020, that it's been heavy. It's been a really tough year. And I think I've had many conversations with clients about people saying, yeah, but, this is where I wanted to be. And I'm like, you are totally forgetting the backdrop of living in a global pandemic. Your most important thing right now is to survive. Like, that's your number one goal for 2020. Like, don't worry about anything else particularly.
Yeah.
That needs to be prioritized. And that includes mental health. So often we think that when we think about health and this pandemic, we think of the physical. And yes, that is the threat most ardently. But because of the distancing measures we've had to take, particularly in Melbourne and particularly in Victoria, we've seen that increase of the mental repercussions. Isolation is a dangerous thing for the human mind. It is one of the biggest dangers in terms of our mental well-being and our physical health. We see a myriad of repercussions that are mostly negative upon that. Now, times of solitude are fine. General isolation for extended periods of time has really adverse effects. So we need to, I think, start taking that a little bit more seriously in the time that we take sort of public health campaigns like diabetes and smoking and exercise seriously. We need to have more conversations around the innate human need for connection and how often that connection can really help us maintain mental well-being and help really starve off some of the complications that come with mental illnesses. Now, of course, it's not the same for everyone, but I would really love to see a little bit more about that moving forward.
Yeah. And just that explanation just makes me smile, and it's so beautiful how you've eloquently described that, because it's so true in the fact that we need to have like contact with people, and that's what makes us human, and that's what brings out like really nice emotions like happiness, love, compassion, and so forth. Whereas if you're being restricted to the confines of your own home and not being able to communicate with people, you're alone with your thoughts. And although sometimes that is nice, if it's all the time, you can go a bit stir nut.
Yeah, you do. And it's an echo chamber, right? You're the only thinker in your mind. There's actually only one voice in there. Now, there might be other narratives from people who perhaps participate in your mind, but they only participate through your permission.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really important delineation to make. So there's 7.8 billion people in the world. It's probably not 7.9 now, but you can still feel lonely. How is that?
Yeah.
And it is because there is only one thinker in your mind. We have evolved to need that human connection. There are cellular and biological reactions that are geared within us to be rewarded and to know that being in group, being around other people is critical to our survival. Because back in the days when we were nomadic roaming people, if we were not in tribes, if we were not in our group and we were not part of a pack, we weren't protected. So our body, our brain would send very clear messages to our body to get to safety, to find your tribe, to build good social connections, to learn and adapt your behavior to others, to want to be in tribe because you will be protected.
Yeah.
And so we kind of all know that. But when it comes to sort of communicating on a daily basis, we sort of forget that. Yeah. And we forget that very often when we look at mental well-being and we think, oh, why is it rising? Why is it doing this? There's a number of reasons for that. We're tracking it better. We have a greater understanding of what it is. We have more data points. We have a greater understanding of what humans need overall because of further research. But really the principles of what we kind of need on an emotional level still remain. We really need that human connection. And while technology has advanced and allowed us to connect with people around the world in an unprecedented time like never before, it's played an important supplementary role to human connection, but it's not a replacement.
Yeah.
I think we need to, again, we go to that black and white thinking, don't we? We go, well, it's all bad and technology is making us antisocial. There have been campaigns about that, about the wireless, about the newspaper. It's gone throughout time with technology.
Yeah.
But we must remember it's the balance of those things. So this is great. I can see you. I can understand. But would I be getting exactly the same reaction should we be sitting in person? Probably not. But is it a great backup for when I can't be in person? Totally.
Yeah. And now that we're able to, I guess, go out and see people in person, we need to appreciate the things like giving each other a hug.
Yeah.
Holding hands and all those things too, because that's what we've been deprived of for so long.
Yeah. Even just smiling, right? It's so difficult. I think everyone's gone to this almost theatrical like smile under their mask so people can see it through their eyes. Like it's a really big smile if you like see a small child in the shopping center because they're probably like, why is everyone wearing masks? And all those sorts of things that we've compensated. But again, I think 2020 does show that we are actually highly adaptable. It's not comfortable, we don't like it, but we're able to adapt. And I think that's the really important thing here, that there's going to be so many things beyond our control. And as we move, particularly as we approach 2050 with the many macro challenges that we have, not only as a nation, but also as a global community of people, it's this ability to respond and adapt, because there's so much we don't know that's coming. And it's always been the case, right? Now, whether or not we find faith in that through religious beliefs, or whether or not we find faith in that through scientific research, or it's a combination of the both, we still have to adapt. We still have to be able to respond to what's in front of us. And I think that if we can let go of this idea that we have to control the externals of the world around us, and actually start focusing on the idea that we can control the internal thoughts and processes that we have, the internal responses, the internal thoughts, the internal feelings, that's actually our greatest chance of having any form of control of the external. Yet so often we want to externalize control, because if I can see it and I can just see that I'm manipulating it and I can see that I'm in control externally, it gives me feedback that it's internally okay. And I think particularly when we talk about mental well-being, we need to balance those a bit better. 100%. And also you can't change anyone but you, so stop trying. That's important.
Yes, ditto. Oh my God.
Yeah. We all know that one.
Yeah.
But we still try.
Yeah, I know. We keep trying, and if we can't fix ourselves, we tend to try and fix others. But
projection, yes.
It is what it is, I suppose. Hopefully, we all improve in that regard, slowly but surely.
Slowly, we'll get there.
You mentioned like the importance of expressing yourself and your thoughts, feelings, and so forth. On a personal level, why is that so important?
Why is talking about how I'm feeling or expressing myself important? So on a personal level for me, I'm quite a deep thinker. So I need some time to really think things through. I do marinate a lot on things, which has its negatives, believe me. But again, I sit in a bit of a biased position where I sort of understand the science that sits behind why this marination is so important, and perhaps why this expressing is so important. Feelings cause biochemical reactions. They cause neurological reactions for things and impetus and action for us to do things. So, while some people really enjoy talking, not everybody does. But the need to express something out of the echo chamber in our mind allows us that clarity of distance, allows us different perspectives. So from an individual level, what's important to me is that I have an avenue for that to have a space to exist outside of myself. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I always share with other people. For me, it would happen through a process of journaling. What's really important to understand is that when we have everything in here, it's really difficult to maintain perspective and maintain almost the journey of how our thoughts are connecting together. When we have a conversation with another person, we invite perspective. We invite different ways of seeing things. We encourage a reframe. And this comes from some great work of Kevin Oshner from Columbia University, where if we look at something from a different perspective, despite the external changing, the way that we think about it and feel about it, our internal can change, and that can change everything.
Yeah.
Okay. And I know that might seem a bit like woo-woo positive psychology, but it's really much steeped in neuroscience. And so the other thing that comes across, or what we know, is that it's an element of labeling. When we say how we feel, when we're able to express our feelings and emotions, we dampen down that emotional response itself. So, having just, those are two basic principles that I sort of use in everyday application. Knowing that those feelings are neither good nor bad, and I just need space to sit with them and understand them a little bit more, or understand my own reaction to a situation. And I can either write it down in a journal, and remember, that's just something that no one ever is going to see. It's completely unfiltered. It's just what I'm thinking and feeling at the time without judgment. Forces me, to go through that process of thinking about my own thinking, that level of metacognition and self-awareness. So I become better at identifying my feelings and understanding my feelings, or understanding my emotions and my reactions to things that might sort of knock me for six, or be that curveball that something's beyond my control. for me, if I think about my motivation, it's my constant curiosity for understanding of self, which leads to an understanding of others, because we can't be socially aware, and I probably can't be a very good practitioner if I don't really have an understanding of self, because we are egocentric. We obviously have an ability to think in a collectivized view and work as a group, but a lot of the time we do obviously think from our own perspective because we're the only thinker in our mind.
Yeah.
So on a personal level, for me, it's quite a cathartic experience. It's an exploratory experience. And what I've really had to learn over the years is to do that process without judgment. So before, I would do it in a very judgmental way. Well, I should have done this, and I could have, why didn't I do that? Oh my gosh, I'm an idiot for not doing this. Like, how could you be so stupid? So I had a very negative, negative automatic thoughts kind of coming through, a lot of that connotation of, when I was reflecting or when I was thinking of the future, it was a judgmental tone, whereas now it's an observational tone. It's rather than cast any form of connotation on those emotions, just to sort of, oh, that's an interesting thing. Further probing into my own sort of thought process of perhaps where those ideas, beliefs, stigmas, biases, where did they come from? What am I really upset about in this situation? What's actually underneath the surface? Now, I think not everybody is going to go through that thought process, nor does everybody have to. But what I want to be really clear about is everybody has the capability to. This is just like an exercise. This is just like exercising your muscles in the gym, or when you go for a run, you want to increase your cardio threshold. All those sorts of things come with practice. But for me, when I think about the practices, it's what allows me to be mentally well, because things don't kind of go unchecked. I jump on top of things quite quickly so they don't spiral out of control. Now, that doesn't mean that I am totally in control the whole time and I don't have emotional meltdowns and I don't have moments, because that's part of being human. It just means that those highs aren't so high for me and those lows aren't so low, and it's much easier for me to return to my state of neutral, to my state of comfort. And so for me, these practices are really important because it allows me to be more of the version of who I want to be externally, because I'm taking care of the version of who I am internally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really nice. And the fact is, like, you've been able to, like, over the years, master that. And that is one of your forms of self-care, because you're able to take out what's in your mind and put it down on paper. And that's what we use for, as counselors, as one of our techniques for people who bottle things up and who can't express to another person how they're feeling, because it could be that person that they've got a problem with, or whatever the case. And I think it's really cathartic. So when you're able to put down what's in your mind on paper, or even if it's on your phone or notes or whatever, you're able to, once that's off your mind, like, let it go, because otherwise you're holding it in and it just makes you feel all these like crappy feelings. So yeah, I totally
you carry around these toxic emotions. Yeah, it's the old Amish that, like, spite is like drinking poison and hoping that the other person dies. Like, it's the only person that it actually ends up affecting is you. So even if somebody else's external actions and they've behaved inappropriately to you, or they are in the wrong and you are in the right, even though that's completely subjective, even if that is the case, you're still carrying around their stuff. You're still sitting at home in your space where this person's nowhere near you, and this person can be on the other side of the world and still emotionally impact you.
Yeah.
So that, as you say, as a counsellor, and that's one of the such a critical thing, an important role that counsellors play, is helping people tease that, often knotted mess of thought processes inside their own mind, and give it a bit of distance.
Yeah.
If we want to see something clearer, we either move into it or we move away to get a different perspective. And I think our thoughts are kind of the same. And sometimes we've got to get them out onto something so we can do that.
Yeah. And it's funny how, like, before we were talking about our dads and how they tend to bottle things up or keep things for themselves, whereas females are generally able to express how they're feeling more so and let it out. I had an experience where someone who I knew had been bottling things up for so long, and then event occurred to them, and everything was flooding back. So it was kind of like PTSD, where they were getting flashbacks of all these traumatic events, and they were just like spilling it out verbally, and we were just like, what the
where's this coming from?
Like, where's this coming from? Like, for someone who is in good health per se, they're able to deal with things a bit easier, whereas people in those headspaces, it takes a very, very long time to just deal with one thing, let alone millions.
Yeah, and it can. And I think this sort of highlights 2 points which are really important to make. Number one, you can't see mental health all the time.
Yeah.
Right. So someone can be internally struggling within their own area and internally struggling with their own internal battle that you have no idea, because it doesn't present the same.
Yeah.
It's unfortunately, it's not like when somebody looks unwell. Now, you can see when someone looks unwell because of mental health, but you don't always see that, and the signs aren't always the same for everyone. So the bottling up is kind of that pressure release. At some point, it has to come out.
Yeah.
And to your point about, perhaps women being more able to express themselves versus men, to me, that's a societal constructed element of gender. So I don't think we're actually born like that. I don't think that boys or girls are born with any different ability to express their emotions and feelings. And rest assured that men do feel their feelings. They just don't have an ability to share it because they've been told through a societal gender construct that's not what you do as a man. And that, to me, is incredibly dangerous, and it's actually life-threatening if we think about it, with the leading cause of men under 45 being suicide. So I probably should put a trigger warning on this podcast now that we've just talked about that, because that's really important. And I do think if you know anybody going through this, there are incredible amounts of resources. Maybe we can chuck them in the show notes, including Lifeline and the great work that they do. But what we need to be really clear about here is that that's not a man thing. That's a society thing, an environmental thing, a nurture thing that we have created. So we've stitched men into this unfair structure that the only way that they can get out is to break out, and that means often extreme behaviour.
Yeah.
So equally, there isn't extreme behaviour, and they just bottle it up, and they carry this heavy burden. So, I really think if we go back to what we're talking about with emotions, if we sort of all came from the premise of actually everyone's going to feel, that's okay, irrespective of race, ethnicity, age, gender, religious affiliation, that's part of it. And a part of being human is learning how to master our emotions. If we came from that point, in the same way that we come from the point of, good health is about eating well and sleeping well and moving well, because that element of emotional health is as important to our body as those physical things that we talk about, we would have a very different conversation. And a lot of these gender norms would actually just start to sort of dissipate, because we'd realize that they're unhelpful structures that we've built.
Absolutely.
That's a good thing about humans. We can change it if we want to. I really do think now is the time.
Yeah. And I think it's slowly happening, like just looking at people from my generation to people who are like little kids, how they express themselves, like boys and girls. And it's so nice to see that there's a shift happening, because that in itself will help prevent future events from occurring, like mental health.
Much more fluidity.
Yeah.
And look, you're at that end of the spectrum in those formidable years and those developmental years, and you can see that the differences that it does make. And I think, particularly from a parental perspective, you feel like you have to have all the answers. You don't have to have all the answers, right? You just have to be willing to learn and listen.
Yeah.
And that's actually it. And the good thing about that is we were all born that way. We're all born innately curious, because that's part of what it means to be human. Until COVID came along, one of the greatest concerns for the World Health Organization is mental health, because of its lack of effective treatment across large groups of people. I would really hope that we do start to move into that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And a forewarning for those who are listening, because of the joys of the internet, there has been a few periods where there's been breakup and it's unstable, so apologies for that. But Shelley's just hit the nail on the head numerous times over. Yeah, and I think if we just keep going in that direction of, I guess, looking after ourselves, both mind, body, and soul, we will eventually be more happier and healthier beings.
Yeah, they go hand in hand.
Yeah. I did touch on it before, I guess, with the self-care, but aside from journaling, what are your other forms of self-care that you use?
So for me, one of the biggest forms of self-care that I've really learned over the last couple of years is sleep, and how important sleep is, and sleep is actually self-care. So for me, sleep is tonight's investment into tomorrow's productivity. Understanding what I do from a scientific perspective about the incredible processes and hugely important processes that happen during your sleep. I don't sacrifice it perhaps as I used to when I burnt the candle at both ends. Perhaps I'm a little bit older, definitely got a few more wrinkles, don't know if I'm any wiser. But in terms of not thinking that sleep is wasted time, or it's unproductive, because it's one of the most productive things. So what I do is really allow myself to sleep when I can, if I can. So aiming at getting a solid 8 hours in a night. And if I'm not able to do that, having some form of recovery sleep where I can get a proper lie-in. For me, it's so important to get that restorative sleeping practice in. Self-care for me is as well making sure that the people I have in my life are people that are positive influences. Now, with our family, we don't always get the choice, and I just want to really caveat here that space between you and other people, even if they're your family members, that allow you to maintain your emotional, social, and your mental well-being, is a really important thing. So I've probably been a bit more cognizant about my relationships, and do my social relationships give me something? So really cognizant of when my energy was being sort of drained around my social relationships, minimizing my time with some of those folk, and making sure that I'm getting a good state of return. And when I say return, it's not like an investment. It's an exchange that I'm feeling really positive, and those social engagements where I'm interacting with other people is in my diary and locked in the same way that a physical appointment of any other description would be locked in. So sleep's really important for me, having those really important social connections. Exercise is my go-to mental health treatment. It always has been. I was quite an anxious child, and I think because of my anxiety, it really accelerated my ability in sport, because what I knew when I was on the sporting pitch of any description is that I couldn't be anywhere else. So I couldn't be running away with my thoughts or feeling worried. Yeah. I just had to be in the moment. So it was a really good therapeutic thing for me that kept me kind of really grounded and allowed me to deal with the big emotions that I was dealing with as a small person. So sport for me, and then conversely as an adult, exercise and training is a non-negotiable. That's really how I know I can maintain a good level of balance for myself.
I love that.
And if I don't have the exercise in there, everything for me starts to sort of fall out. Everything sort of falls off. And the last thing I would add to that is a meditative type practice. So whether or not that's sitting in a meditation, or that's practicing some form of mindfulness, or that's even just having my moments of journaling and self-reflection, I sort of have a mental clear out. I have that space of what's going on with me, what's up, what's been happening, sort of a conversation of a check-in that a friend would have with me, but I'm having it with myself.
Amazing.
Because what I don't want is those big iceberg moments where something's been building, and I'm heading straight towards it, and I don't have time to turn away, and I'm going to run into it. Now, that's not always possible. And what I would say to people is, that's what works for me. It's not necessarily what works for everyone. And, there's time pressures and constraints. And do I do those things perfectly in balance 7 days of every week? Absolutely not. I'm totally human, and I haven't mastered any of it. But I know sort of the recipe of what can make a really good outcome for me. Balance that with what's happening, with the easier the process becomes. So the more that I practice and checking in and scheduling those things in, the easier it becomes. And, life takes twists and turns, and it will change again. But the non-negotiables for me, once I was clear on what they were to maintain my own mental well-being and therefore promote my physical well-being, it actually became much easier for them to fall into place versus thinking, oh, I should do something. So certain types of meditative practices just don't work for me. That's not what I do. If I can't get a meditation in, I'll get a yoga in because I've got physical and I've got the mental as well. It's moving meditation after all. If I can't get to a yoga class, okay, I've got 15 minutes, I'm going to do something on YouTube. And I think once we understand that this association of investment in self is just adapting to what's in front of me, but having the principles of what's important, so the things that matter, physical exercise, good sleep, good social connection, some form of self-reflection, the way that happens can be a bit more fluid. I think we get quite caught up in, if I'm not following the T, then it's not going to work. But what I sort of say to people here is find what works for you and trust yourself here. Trust your innate knowingness about what you actually need, because your brain and your body is really clever. It will give you quite clear messages.
Yeah.
You might not know exactly what, but you'll know when something doesn't click. If it's not clicking, don't be afraid to try something. Have to just be one thing. It's going to be a combination of things.
Yeah, and I think that everyone's going to have different things that work for them for self-care, and as you said, it's not only going to be that one thing. You need multiple self-care tips and tricks up your sleeve at all times,
totally,
depending on what's happening in your life. Solitude, and not solitude, but like meditative states may not work for you. Maybe you need that music to lift you up and fill your cup, or going for a walk and exercise. Like, it really depends.
Yeah. Clear your head. Yeah, totally.
I guess for our last question, which I ask all my guests, what are your 3 things that you would recommend to unearth our well-being?
So the first thing I've got to say is it's really individual. But what I have sort of seen through my own experience, and perhaps the top 3 that tend to land quite well for the people that we work with, is understanding self. So the meditative self practices where you're able to sit with you in your own thoughts and reflect on what is happening, and to view that as a productive thing, not a waste of time. So I deal with a lot of business owners, entrepreneurs, founders, a lot of people who are so busy. They're running organizations, they're leaders in organizations, they have families, they have commitments, they have mortgages, they have everything on top of that. How important it is to see introspection, reflecting, using metacognition, analyzing your own thinking, thinking about your own thinking, having some time and space away from the external noise. So many people think that's unproductive. I think it's a waste of time, and like, I'm just too busy. If we are too busy with that stuff, eventually our brain and body just say no to everything else, right? So time away from those things, even if it's just 5 minutes of self-reflection, and you can do this while you're sitting in your car driving. You don't necessarily have to have all your meditation stuff set up with incense burning and crystals. You don't have to even be into any of that for this to work. It's just that moment to check in with myself. How am I doing? What's going on for me? How am I feeling? There's 3 simple questions, even once a week, will start to make that conversation with self and self-awareness, and therefore awareness of our own mental well-being prioritized. I think the other thing I would say is, and because of its huge amounts of clinical research that support it, is investment in sleep. Sleep is so critical to well-being. We think, again, it's unproductive. I'm just lying there. Your brain is in parts more active when you're asleep than when you're watching television. Or you're watching Netflix. I don't think most of us watch TV anymore. We watch screens of some description. I think sleep is a really important element for well-being. One of the most important things that I say to people is, I just feel so this and that and tired and exhausted. And I'm like, you need to just sleep more. You're literally telling me what the problem is. So if you're tired, what do you tell a 3-year-old to do? They have a nap, they have a sleep, they have some rest. We kind of forget that with ourselves all the time. So the thing is creating a bit of space for self-reflection, whether or not that's journaling, having a conversation with yourself, some meditative or mindfulness practices, just going to yoga a little bit more, because you do a lot of self-reflection in yoga, particularly if you're quite switched in with your practitioner or teacher. Getting better sleep. Now, if you're a 5-hour person, that's okay. Let's not jump to 10. Let's just try and get 6. And once we've got 6, let's just try and get 7. The adult mind really needs about 8 to 10 hours sleep to function effectively. The teenage mind is more, the child mind is more, but the adult mind to really be optimal requires those things. And the last thing I would say, because it's so critical, again, there's such a big body of research in terms of mood stabilization, perspective, cognitive function, overall health, is activity. We need physical activity. We are not designed to sit and plug information into screens constantly. We are designed to move. There's the common phrase, and Dr. Izzy Smith talks about this a lot, where she says that, sitting is the new smoking, and there's so many repercussions from sitting still. So unearthing well-being is just finding the movement that feels good to you. Now, that movement can be dancing in your living room to your favorite, soundtrack or your favorite Spotify playlist. That's still movement. It can be playing outside with the kids in the yard. It can be taking the dog for a walk. It can be as simple as getting on a bike and going for a ride, or, going to the gym. Whatever it is that helps you feel better, get moving. And if I go back to where I started, when you're in a movement, you can't often think about other things. Repetitive cardio is probably the only thing that allows you to do that. So running, cycling, swimming. But even then, you have a clear head because of your surroundings. Yes. It's a different perspective. That reframing comes into it. Most other things require your focus in the moment. And so it allows you space and time away from all that sort of internal chatter that keeps going on. And also, we have such a combination of good neurotransmitters hormones that are released when it comes to exercise. And that's critical for really taking care of ourselves. So even just one of those three would help. But if we can find a way to bring in those three, that overall will just make sure that our mental well-being is a little bit more safeguarded.
That's the best. And I think they're really important just for your everyday survival as well.
Yeah, we take them for granted.
Yeah, 100%. Oh, thank you so much. I hope everyone took something away from this podcast, besides the blips with technology, but yeah,
it's all part of it.
Exactly. And it was amazing to have you on. So thank you so much once again.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Well, take care and have an amazing Christmas.
Thank you very much. Same to you.
I hope you found this discussion with Shelley Laslett educational. She really is informative and brilliant in all rights. She really sung to my heart. If you are interested in contacting Shelley for some assistance, you can find her contact details via her website www.vitae.coach/. If anything you heard has been triggering, please reach out to someone who can help keep you safe. Or remember, you can find Lifeline at any time on 13 11 14. You are not alone. To ensure Ask Elizabeth and Unearthing Wellbeing continues to grow, please subscribe and rate the podcast. Feel free to also share and tag us on your socials. I hope you have a lovely day. Be safe and be kind. Take care.